If you're using Anchor to turn your WordPress blog posts into audio, which can be uploaded to Spotify and other podcasting platforms, but you don't want the automatic voice, either male or female, you can record it yourself or re-record the blog post using your own voice, and Anchor gives you that option. So I'll go back to my episode lists. These are all the blog posts which have been imported into Anchor, and I'm going to choose a relatively short blog post, this one here, which is in fact actually for a podcast which is on Spotify, so that's probably a good example to use. Here you can see just the text only, so all the images and videos are taken out of that. There is a podcast that is held on Spotify which is embedded in this blog post. If I go to the actual post, you can see it here, but I'm using this one as an example because it's short. So yeah, check that you're using the correct input. In my case, it's a USB headset microphone. I'm not going to automatically convert this time. I'm going to re-record it myself. So as soon as I press this button, I'm going to start recording this with my own voice. On the 5th of April 2020, I gave an interview for the IATEFL Teacher Development SIG podcast DevelopPod. The interviewer was Christian Tipladi, who was speaking to me from his home in Brighton. The whole episode was put together with James Taylor, who comes from that town in the south of England, and this happens to be the place where I gave my first ever presentation at any language teacher conference in 2018. It is the 20th episode of the podcast, and it's 2020 of course. It also coincides with Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK and was published just in time on the final day, Sunday, of that week. You can access the full podcast via the dedicated DevelopPod website. It is also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I've listened back to the edited interview a couple of times and I'm very happy with the result. With a rough idea of the questions but without notes, I spoke from my own mind and experience on the topic of mental health in general and especially within ELT. My lived experience hopefully comes through. I've been quite anxious recently for different reasons, but know that I am a resourceful person and manage my condition. It mentions this article on COVID-19 and mental health, which I recently published, as well as my presentations in Brighton 2018 and Liverpool in 2019. I would welcome comments here. Please feel free to share, as this topic is as important as ever, I feel, especially with the recent restrictions of COVID-19 regulations and the move to fully online teaching in many areas. Okay, so I've stopped the recording now. I made a couple of mistakes there, but this is just a demonstration. On the 5th of April 2020, I gave an interview for the IATEFL Teacher Development SIG podcast DevelopPod. The interviewer was Christian Tipladi, who was speaking to me from his home in Brighton. So that's a preview of how it will sound. I'm pretty happy with that, so let's save and continue. You can of course re-record it if you're not too happy. Note that there's no option to pause, so that's something to consider, that you can't pause the recording. You can only re-record it. Okay, so that's now worked. Now I can add a transition or a piece of music, but I'm not going to do that yet. That's for a later demo. I'm going to save the episode. And here we have the episode option, so I can edit the title if I want to, but I'm going to keep it like that. I'm going to keep the link to the blog post in the description. I'm going to publish it now, although as I said before, you can schedule a post. Let's click Publish Now. And you can add a Spotify link to that post, so you can go back to that post on WordPress, but I'm not going to do that at the moment, so I can click Return to WordPress and do that there. But what I can do is I can copy that link and then I can add that to that blog post. So I can go back in and add this to this blog post here, or I can just leave it on Anchor and also on Spotify. Okay, I've gone back to my dashboard, or my public profile. I click on Listen on Spotify, and that brings up the show. They call it the show on Spotify. Here is the podcast, and I can play it in Spotify. On the 5th of April 2020, I gave an interview for the IATEFL Teacher Development SIG podcast DevelopPod. The interviewer was Christian Tiplady, who was speaking to me from his home in Brighton. Okay, so this is just a demonstration, just an example, although I will keep this one on there as an example. It does sound a little unnatural because you're reading a script, you're reading words as opposed to speaking more naturally, which you would expect more on a podcast. So you may be more skilled with creating a podcast, you may be more used to recording a podcast using more natural voice, and that usually comes from less scripted and less read documentation, but that's up to you how you use that, I would have thought. Okay, I've gone back into my blog post and I'm going to type in the HTML here. There we go. I'm going to preview that. There we go, and there we have an embedded podcast, which is what you just heard. I'm going to update that, and that will now appear as an embedded audio within the same blog post as the embedded TDSig podcast.